Let me ask you something quietly. It's late. The house is still. He's in the other room, or maybe already asleep. You're sitting with a cup of tea that's gone cold, and a small realization settles over you. You don't need him to fix anything right now. You don't need him to decide. You don't need him to solve a problem that only he can solve. And in that quiet, the distance feels wider than it has in years. Even though he's still under the same roof, there's nothing wrong with you for feeling this. The emptiness didn't arrive because you started asking for too much. It arrived the moment you stopped needing him in the old ways. I want you to sit with that for a second. Most women your age have been taught to measure a man's love by what he does. So when the doing slows down and the emotional space doesn't fill the gap, the first thought is usually, what did I do wrong? Or am I expecting something unreasonable now? You're not. Margaret was 63 when she noticed it, while 28 years of marriage. For most of those years, she had quietly tracked his care through action. The roof that got repaired without her asking, the bills that were handled, the way he always had an answer when something broke or went wrong. She believed that was loyalty. She believed that was love showing up. Then he retired. Her own life grew a little more self-sufficient. The children were settled. A few health issues made big physical tasks harder for him, and she simply began handling more things herself. Nothing dramatic, no big announcement, just a natural shift. And slowly, he grew quieter. Not angry, not distant in the obvious way, just thinner somehow. Present in the house, but less present in the relationship. She would look at him across the dinner table and feel as if she were living with a man who was slowly losing the ground he used to stand on. That feeling is more common than most people admit after 55. Because for a large number of men in this generation, being needed was never just a feeling. It was the structure that held their sense of worth together. From early adulthood, providing, fixing, carrying the practical weight, those were the clearest proofs that they mattered. Over 30 or 40 years, that role stopped being something they did and became something they were. It became the quiet backbone of how they knew themselves inside a relationship. So when the practical need begins to ease, when you no longer reach for him first with every problem, when you stop requiring the constant solving, something inside him goes quiet in a way he rarely has language for. It isn't rage. It isn't jealousy in the usual sense. It's a low, private disorientation. If she doesn't need me to do these things anymore, then what exactly am I still doing here? That question doesn't always rise to the surface as clear thought. More often it shows up as withdrawal. He becomes busier with small tasks. He talks less about anything that isn't practical. The emotional room between you gets thinner, not because the affection has vanished, but because the identity that used to fill that room is no longer being fed in the only way he knows how to feed it. This is the part most conversations about loyalty never reach. They talk about effort and appreciation and emotional connection, as if those things exist in a vacuum. They rarely look at how deeply a man's loyalty can still be attached to the role of being necessary, especially after decades of living inside that role. When the role starts to lose its daily usefulness, the loyalty that was built around it often begins to wobble. Not because he stopped caring about you, because the version of himself that felt solid and valuable inside the relationship suddenly has nowhere clear to stand. And rather than learn a different way of being present, the quieter, less useful kind of presence that simply stays and feels, many men protect the old structure by pulling back. Silence becomes safer than the unfamiliar ground of just being there without a job to do. That is what was beginning to happen with Margaret's husband, and it is what happens inside more men over 55 than anyone usually says out loud. That quiet disorientation does not stay small for long. Inside many men over 55, it begins to rearrange the emotional architecture of the relationship itself. The man who once felt solid because there was always something to fix, something to carry, something only he could handle, suddenly finds the old measures of his worth no longer lighting up. The practical requests slow down. The automatic reach for his opinion lessens. And what rises in their place is not clarity, but a low-grade unease he rarely names even to himself. He does not think, "I am losing my value." The thought is more formless than that. It registers as a subtle thinning of purpose inside the partnership. The days feel flatter. Conversations that used to orbit around solving or deciding now feel empty of direction. He may still care for her. He may still want the marriage or the connection to continue. But the version of himself that knew how to belong inside it is no longer being called upon. And without that call, he does not know where to place his weight. So he protects what is left of the old structure the only way he knows how. By pulling the emotional volume down, he stays in the house. He still performs the remaining practical tasks. But the deeper availability, the willingness to simply sit in the quiet with her, to feel without fixing, to be present without a role, begins to shrink. Silence becomes a form of self-preservation. Business with small, controllable things becomes safer than the unfamiliar territory of being needed only for who he is rather than what he can still do. This is the mechanism most women never get to see clearly. They experience the withdrawal as distance or loss of interest. What they are actually meeting is a man whose primary way of mattering inside a relationship is being dismantled in real time, and who has almost no practice at remaining when that way is gone. Over decades, he came to confuse the two things. Loyalty, in his internal accounting, was largely proven by the years of provision and problem-solving. When those years were still being required, the loyalty felt robust and mutual. When the requirement eased, the loyalty that had been built on the role began to reveal its limits. What remained was often thinner than either of them expected, not because the affection had been false, but because so much of the emotional glue had been attached to the position of being necessary rather than to the woman as a separate, whole person who might one day need less of the old performance. That realization, when it finally reaches him, and it often reaches him late and sideways, carries a private grief. He may never speak it. He may not even fully recognize it as grief. It simply sits as a heavier quiet, a reduced willingness to risk the more vulnerable forms of closeness. Because if he steps into the relationship without the armor of usefulness, he will have to face the possibility that the bond was never as independent of his function as he had believed. Margaret felt this shift without having the language for it. She kept waiting for the emotional presence to return once the practical load lightened. It did not. What returned instead was a man who still lived beside her, but no longer seemed to know how to meet her in the spaces that had nothing to do with tasks. The loyalty she had trusted for 28 years had been real in its way. It had simply been more conditional on the role than either of them had understood. Many women your age carry a parallel private question. You spent years measuring care through action because that was the language available. You stayed loyal to what he did. You adjusted your expectations around the practical proofs he offered, and when those proofs became less frequent, and the emotional room did not expand to fill the difference, the first doubt that rose was often directed inward. Did I start wanting too much? Was it unreasonable to hope that once the heavy lifting eased, something quieter and more personal would take its place? It was not unreasonable. Wanting to be met by the man himself, not only by the man in function, is not excess. It is the most ordinary human longing once the long season of necessity begins to change. You are not too much for noticing the gap. You were never too much for wanting the relationship to rest on more than what he could still provide. Understanding the mechanism does not require you to fix him or to shrink yourself back into needing more than you actually need. It simply removes the false story that the distance is primarily your doing. The collapse of loyalty that was built on usefulness is not a moral failure on either side. It is what happens when a long-standing identity structure meets a life stage that no longer feeds it. and the man has not yet learned another way to stand inside the relationship. Some men do learn. They discover, sometimes slowly and with difficulty, that presence without a job is still presence. That being needed for quiet company, for shared ordinary hours, for the simple fact of remaining emotionally reachable, can become a different kind of worth. Others never make that turn. They continue to protect the old architecture by staying partially withdrawn, waiting, often without realizing they are waiting, for the next practical crisis that will let them feel necessary again. You cannot force the turn. What you can do is stop measuring the health of the connection solely by how much he still does, and begin noticing more carefully whether he is willing to stay when there is nothing left to solve. That distinction matters more after 55 than almost any other. You have the right to want a man who can remain when the old roles grow quiet. You also have the right to protect the peace you have built if that capacity is simply not there. The clarity itself is already a form of steadiness. It does not demand drama or ultimatums. It simply lets you see the terrain as it is, without the old confusion that the emptiness must be your fault for no longer needing him the way you once did. That quieter seeing is enough for now.